I'm going to be a little different than the rest. I'm going to take my watch off, and I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to write down the time that I started. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to end early, but at least when I look at it, I'll know how long I've been talking. My name is Charlie Parmy, and I'm a very grateful recovering alcoholic. Because I'm a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the grace of the power that I found in the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I haven't found it necessary to take a drink for 7,991 days today, one day at a time, and for this I'm very grateful. It's great to be here in Louisiana again and getting ready to talk about the thing I love to talk about the most, myself, and the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. A little bit about my story before we're through this morning. I want to thank the committee for asking me to be here and giving me the opportunity to be able to share. I think this is about the third time I've been in Louisiana in the last 6 months. And it's great to be asked to come back to somewhere. I used to be asked to leave quite often, and it's nice to be able to come back to an area. I want to thank the other speakers this weekend. We could leave here this morning without me saying anything more, and my story would have already been told. Rose did a great job on it Friday night. And of course, we all know Buck in Virginia. Loved them for years. And Buck told my story when he talked yesterday. In fact, I told Buck there's no sense in me talking Sunday morning. You've already told him about everything I know. I loved my friend Joe last night. My main job this morning is to explain to you what Joe tried to say to you last night. Barbara told me before I came down here, and she always says so, she said, Charlie, when you get behind the podium, for God's sake, talk about spirituality and don't talk about sex. And I said, Barbara, I don't know anything that's any more spiritual than sex. I spent the first 50 years of my life praying I could do it twice. I've spent the last 10 years praying that I could do it once. I don't suffer from Alzheimer's disease. I suffer from sometimer's disease. Sometimes I can and sometimes I can't. And we've all looked at this great fellow here on the left all weekend, this fellow named Harold. He dresses up, he cleans up quite well for an old drunk. And I heard a story about Harold the other day. They told me he had been sick and had to go to the doctor. And the doctor examined him the best he could, but he said, Harold, I really can't tell what's wrong with you because we haven't had an opportunity to do all the blood work and all the tests necessary. He said, I'd like for you to come back in a week, and when you do, I want you to bring me 3 things. I want you to bring me a urine sample. I want you to bring me a feces sample, and I want you to bring me a semen sample. And Harold said, all right, and as he started out the door, his wife Janice was with him. And you know, Harold doesn't hear very good, so he turned to Janice and said, what was it he wanted me to bring next week? And she said, he said he wants you to bring your underwear. When you get as old as me and Harold, you understand. I've heard people in the last few years, when they refer to me, referring to me as an AA fundamentalist. And I'm not sure that I know what an AA fundamentalist is. But if it's to love the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, then I'm probably an AA fundamentalist. If it's to love the big book Alcoholics Anonymous with all your heart and the message contained within that book, then I'm probably an AA fundamentalist. If it's to love your God as you understand him with all your heart and all your soul, then surely I'm probably an AA fundamentalist. Because you see, those are the three reasons I'm here this morning. If it had not been for the Fellowship Alcoholics Anonymous, I would never have found the big book and the program in that book. And if it wasn't for the big book and the program in the book, I never would have found God as I understand him, and I wouldn't be here today. And those are the things that I mainly want to try to talk about a little bit this morning. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about my drinking. If you're an alcoholic, you already know all you need to know about drinking. If you're one of those people who lived with us during our drinking years, you know about all you need to know about our drinking. What I really would like to talk about a little bit this morning is my first drunk, my last drunk, and a little bit about what went on in between. And I think I'm like most people in AA. When I was a kid growing up, I was always on the outside of the crowd looking in. Always wanted to be a part of, and knew that whatever I did, whatever I said would be the wrong thing. People would laugh and I would be embarrassed. And when I was a kid going to high school, I was a little short kid. I was always kind of chubby and always wore these glasses. And most of the guys that I ran around with were into some kind of athletic programs in high school. And I always wanted to be a part of that scene, but found I could not do so. I remember one time going to the basketball coach and asking him to let me try out for the basketball team. Now, I'm not sure what he said, but it seems as though he said, "Son, I'm sorry, but little short fat boys that wear glasses don't make very good basketball players. Why don't you try out for the football team?" And I remember going to the football coach and asking him, and it seemed as though he said also, "Son, I'm sorry, but little short fat boys that wear glasses don't make very good football players." And it seemed as though everything I wanted to do and tried to do that the other kids were doing, always I was a failure at it and scared to death that people were going to laugh about it. I noticed also about that period of my life, walking down the halls of the school, quite often I would see some old boy and he would have his arm around a girl, and he'd kind of have her head laying over on his shoulder, and she would be looking up at him with those great eyes. And I wanted to do some of that also. But I found out the little short fat boys that wore glasses didn't do any better with the girls than they did with the football coach or the basketball coach. And I remember one time we had a dance out in an old barn out in the country. And it was a school dance, and they'd taken an old dairy barn, converted it into a dance hall. Upstairs part where they used to store the hay had been made into the dance floor. The downstairs part where the old stanchions were, they had tables and you could sit there and drink a Coke and visit and etc. I was 14 years old, and I was standing against the wall upstairs in that old barn. The music was playing, the kids were dancing, and I was standing there watching them. There was a little girl out there dancing named Betty, and I'd been watching Betty for quite some time, and I'd been wanting to do something with her, but I never did say anything to her because I knew she'd say no, and the kids would laugh, and I would be embarrassed. And this time I told myself, as soon as this music stops playing, I'm going to ask Betty to dance with me. And the music stopped playing, and I started walking toward Betty. And as I did, my mind began to say such things as, "Charlie, what are you going to do?" She says, "No." And all these kids are going to hear, and they're going to laugh, and you're going to be embarrassed. And my footsteps got slower and slower. And then my mind said, "Charlie, what are you going to do?" She says, "Yes." And you're going to step on her toes, and you're going to stumble, and she's going to scream, and she's going to slap your face, and everybody's going to laugh, and you'll be embarrassed. And my footsteps got slower and slower, and before I could get to Betty, the music started playing, and some other guy grabbed Betty, and they started dancing. And I went back against the wall, and I said to myself, as soon as this music stops, I'm going to ask Betty to dance with me. And the music stopped, and I started walking toward Betty, and again my mind did the same thing. It said, "What are you going to do?" She says, "No." And then, "What are you going to do?" She says, "Yes." And my footsteps got slower and slower, and before I could get to Betty, the music started. Another guy grabbed her. They started dancing. I went back against the wall, and I said, as soon as this music stops, I'm going to ask Betty to dance with me. Now, a big old, tall, slender guy that I knew came sidling up to me, and he said, "Charlie, how would you like to go outside with me and have a drink of moonshine?" Well, I didn't know what moonshine was, but I didn't want to tell him no because I knew the other kids had heard him ask me, and they would laugh, and I would be embarrassed if I said no, so I said, yeah, that would be fine. Now, we go downstairs, and we go to his car, and he opens up the trunk, and he pulls out a quart jar of moonshine. He took the top off of it, and he took a drink, and he handed it to me. And I put it up to my lips, and as I did, the moonshine began to flow into my mouth, and great things began to take place. As soon as it crossed my lips began to tingle a little bit. And as soon as it hit my teeth, they kind of chattered up and down. And when it hit my tongue, I could feel my tongue begin to grow and expand and swell and get bigger and bigger. It hit my cheeks, and my cheeks kind of fluttered in and out. And at the same time, I could feel it passing up through my sinus cavities into my forehead, and I got a feeling in my forehead which was absolutely indescribably wonderful. Well, I haven't even swallowed it yet. I've just got it in my mouth. When I swallowed that drink of moonshine, great things really did begin to happen. As it started down through my esophagus, of course, those of you that have been there know that it felt like liquid fire running down my throat. I damn near choked to death on it as it went down. But when it got about halfway down through my chest, I felt my chest begin to grow and expand and get bigger and bigger. And it hit my stomach, and it just literally exploded like a bomb. And immediately I could feel it racing through my arms, and as I did, they got longer and longer, and it hit my hands and fingers, and they began to tingle and vibrate. And at the same time, it's racing through my arms, it's racing through my legs, and my legs are getting longer and longer, and I'm getting taller and taller. And it hit my feet and my toes, and they got a hot, intense, burning, exciting, get up and go somewhere and do something feeling. And this guy looked at me and he said, "Would you like to have another drink?" And from the tremendous height that I'd already grown to, I looked down on his head and I said, "Yeah, I believe I'll have one more of them." And I took another drink, and we started back up the stairs into that old barn, and great things began to take place as I began to walk up the stairs. I found that I knew a new freedom and a new happiness. I comprehended the word serenity, and I knew peace. No matter how far down the scale I'd gone, I could see how my experience would benefit others. I had a freedom from fear and economic insecurity. And I walked up those stairs, and I walked into that place where those kids were dancing, and I went over against the wall, and I said to myself, as soon as the music stops, I'm going to ask Betty to dance with me. And the music stopped, and I began to walk toward Betty, and this time my mind didn't say, "What are you going to do?" She says no, because I knew that Betty would say yes. And my mind didn't say, "What are you going to do?" She says yes, and you step on her toes, and she said, because I knew I'd be able to dance with her, okay. And I walked straight up to Betty, and I said, "Betty, how would you like to dance with me?" And she said, "Well, yeah, that's all right. That'd be fine." And Betty and I began to dance, and sure enough, I didn't stumble and fall, and I didn't step on her toes. And as that tune drew to an end, I said, "Betty, how would you like to dance with me again?" And she said, "Well, yeah, that's great." She said, "Charlie, you're a good dancer." She said, "I didn't know you could dance." And I said, "I didn't either, but let's do it again." Now, to the best of my recollection, nobody else danced with Betty that night. I really believe that I danced every tune with her the rest of that evening. And as the dance drew to a close, I found myself doing something I'd never been able to do before. I said, "Betty, can I take you home from the dance?" And she said, "Well, yeah, that'd be all right." You know, I didn't have a car to take Betty home in, but I knew a guy that had one, and he happened to be a tall, slender fella, and he had a quart of the moonshine in the back of his car. And I asked him if Betty and I could go home with he and his girlfriend, and he said, "Well, yeah, come on, that would be fine." And we went downstairs, and we opened up the trunk, and we got out the quart of moonshine, and we put it in the back seat. And he and his girlfriend got in the front seat, Betty and I got in the back seat, and we began to tool it down the road toward home. And as we did, my mind began to think a little bit. It said, "You know, you've asked this girl to dance with you," and she said, "Okay." And you danced with her, and you didn't make a fool of yourself, and you're taking her home from the dance. And my mind said, "I wonder what she'd do if I would reach over and put my arm around her and pull her over against my shoulder. Would she lay her head on my shoulder, or would she slap my face?" And as I rode a little further and thought about that some more, I decided to do that, and I put my arm around Betty, and I pulled her over against me, and sure enough, she laid her head on my shoulder, and she looked up at me with those great eyes, just like those girls were doing with the other guys in school, and I thought, man, you have really been missing out on something in your life. And we rode a little further, and my mind began to think again, and it said, "You're taking this girl home from the dance, you got her in the back seat of the car, you got her head on your shoulder." I thought, I wonder what she'd do if I would kiss her. Now, I'd never kissed a girl before, and didn't know for sure how you do it, but I'd seen them do it in the movies. And I knew if you're going to kiss one of them, you got to get their face in just the right position. And then as you kiss them, you lean down and put your lips against theirs, and you close your eyes as you're doing so. So I rode a little further and thought about that some more and decided I would do that. And I took my right hand and I reached over and I got Betty by the chin. And I got her face just right, and I leaned down and put my lips on hers and closed my eyes at the same time. Now, I don't really know what I expected. I didn't know whether she would scream or slap my face, but she acted like she kind of enjoyed that. The next thing I knew, her little lips began to move, and my little lips began to move, and it felt as if there were a spark of electricity flowing between the two of us, and it was a feeling that really was indescribably wonderful. And I said, man, you really have been missing out on life. And as we rode a little further, my mind began to think again, and it said, here you've got this girl in the back seat of this car, and you're taking her home from the dance, and you got her head on your shoulder, and you've kissed her, and she didn't slap your face. And I said, I wonder what she'd do if I'd reach over there and get hold of one of those things. Now, I'd never had hold of one of those things before, and I didn't know any more about getting hold of one of them than I did about kissing the girl, but I knew that if you're going to kiss her, you're going to get hold of one of those things, you ought to be kissing them at the same time. So again, I reached over with my right hand, and I got Betty by the chin, and I got her face just right, and I leaned down to put my lips on hers, but this time I didn't close my eyes because I wanted to see what my right hand was getting ready to do. And as I kissed Betty, I reached over there and I got hold of one of those things with my right hand. Now let me tell you something. If you're a little short, fat boy that wears glasses, and you've been thinking about getting hold of one of those things for a long time, and you get one of them in your hand for the first time, that is a feeling that is absolutely indescribably wonderful for sure. I'd never felt anything like that before. And I'm not so damn sure I've ever felt anything like that since then. That was my first spiritual experience that night in the back seat of that 36 Chevrolet. Now, I'm not going to talk any more about Betty. People used to say, Charlie, why don't you finish the story? And I used to say, well, the reason I don't finish that story is I don't believe in talking about those things from behind the podium. But today I know for sure the reason I don't finish that story is I don't know the rest of that story. Because you see, something else was happening to me that night too. When I was doing these things with Betty, these things that were the most exciting things I'd ever done in my life, the greatest thing a 14-year-old boy could be doing, this thing that was so important to me, there seemed to be something within my body that kept telling me, why don't you stop this and reach over there and get some of that stuff in that jug? And it didn't make any difference how exciting what I was doing was with Betty was, every once in a while I would have to stop and reach over there and pick up that jug and take another drink of that alcohol. And somewhere that night I just went out of the picture. I don't know whether I went to sleep, whether I passed out or what, but somewhere that night I just flat went out of the picture, and I don't remember the rest of that story. You see, I think that night I evidenced what every alcoholic must have in order to be an alcoholic, an abnormal reaction to alcohol. It seemed as though that alcohol produced within my body a physical craving that was so strong that it overcame the ability of my mind to stop me from drinking after I'd once started. And that physical craving was so strong that I'd have to quit what I was doing with Betty and reach over there and get some more booze until after a while I just went out of the picture, and the thing I was doing that was so important didn't seem to be that important anymore. You know, I think every alcoholic has to have a physical allergy to alcohol in order to be a real alcoholic. Now, the next morning I woke up at home in my bed, and I don't remember how I got home, and I don't remember what happened the night before. And I wake up in my bed and I don't feel good, and I'm hung over and I'm sick already, and I'm only 14 years old, and I'm shaking and I'm trembling the next morning, and I tried to remember what took place the night before. And my mind could concentrate on one thing and one thing only. It did not concentrate on what alcohol did to me. It did not concentrate on the fact that I'm sick and shaken. It concentrated only on one thing, what alcohol did for me. I could remember that great feeling that I got when I took that drink. I could remember that great sense of ease and comfort that I felt as I walked up the steps back into that dance hall. I could remember the ability to do things with Betty I'd never been able to do before. I could remember only what alcohol did for me, not what it did to me. I think I evidenced the next morning what every alcoholic must have, an obsession of the mind with alcohol. An obsession of the mind is an idea that overcomes all ideas to the contrary. An obsession of the mind is an idea that is so strong that it pushes out all other ideas. And the great obsession of every alcoholic is that someday, somehow, we're going to be able to drink without getting drunk. Someday, somehow, we're going to be able to drink without getting sick. Someday, somehow, it remembers only what alcohol does for us, never what it does to us. Now, other people who knew me could see almost immediately in my life what alcohol was doing to me. Because every time I had an opportunity to test it out and see if it would do that for me again, I would drink some more. And every time it would do the same thing. It would give me that great feeling, but also sometime during the night I would simply pass out of the picture. And I'd wake up the next morning sick and shaking and trembling, remembering what it did for me, not what it did to me. My mother said to me when I was 15 years old, she said, "Son, I need to talk to you about your drinking." She said, "Don't you know that you have an uncle that's in an insane asylum in the state of California?" And she said, "He's dying from alcoholism. He's in there because he's a wet brain." And she said, "If you continue to drink the way you drink, someday you're going to be in one of those places too." My mother could differentiate the true from the false. She could see the truth about my alcohol from the very beginning. I couldn't see it. I said to Mama, "Mama, don't you worry about me. If alcohol ever gets to be a serious problem with me, I'll quit drinking. Don't you worry." My daddy said to me when I was 16 years old, he said, "Son, I need to talk to you about your drinking." He said, "All my brothers and all my sisters, and including myself, we've all tried to drink." And he said, "Nobody in the Parmley family can drink safely." And he said, "Every one of us that's ever tried to drink, we've got in serious trouble with it. And the only ones that have been able to survive it are those that stop drinking." And he said, "You drinking just like all the rest of the Parmleys drink." And he said, "If you continue to drink the way you are, you're going to destroy your life." And I said, "Oh, Daddy, don't you worry about me." I said, "I'm just half Parmley. I'm not like you and your brothers, and if alcohol gets to be a serious problem in my life, I'll quit drinking. Don't you worry about it." You see, the inability to differentiate the true from the false. Every alcoholic has to have that if we're to be successful drinkers. When I was 17 years old, I woke up in an army hospital in Bremerhaven, Germany, and there was a doctor standing beside of my bed, and he said, "Son, I need to talk to you about your drinking." He said, "I don't know whether you know it or not, but he said, you already died twice in the last 2 days. And he said, what I need to tell you is if you continue to drink alcohol, you'll never live to be 30 years old." I said, "Doctor, you don't understand me. If alcohol ever gets to be a serious problem in my life, I'll stop drinking. It won't kill me." The inability to differentiate the true from the false. When I was about 23 years old, a young lady that I'd married when I was 21, a beautiful young lady, said to me, "Charlie, I need to talk to you about your drinking." She said, "You're a good man, and you're a good husband, and I love you dearly. But," she said, "your drinking is getting completely out of hand." And she said, "I don't know what you're doing and where you're going and don't really care, but what I need to tell you is if you continue to drink the way you drink, sooner or later I'll have to divorce you even though I love you very deeply." And I said, "Oh, honey, don't worry about that. If alcohol gets to be a serious problem in our marriage, I'll stop drinking. You will never have to worry about that." The inability to differentiate the true from the false. When I was 27 years old, my boss called me into the office and he said, "Charlie, I need to talk to you about your drinking." He said, "You're one of the finest employees we've got." And he said, "I don't know whether you know it or not, but you're slated to take my job when I retire in 2 years. But," he said, "what I need to tell you is this, you're drinking too much." And he said, "I don't know what you do at night and where you go and don't really care, but it's beginning to interfere with your work." And he said, "I'm beginning to smell it on you once in a while when you come in the mornings, and what I need to say to you is, if you don't stop drinking, we're going to have to fire you sooner or later." And I said, "Oh, boss, don't worry. If alcohol gets to be a serious problem with my job, I'll quit drinking. Don't worry about that." 24 years later, 24 years from the time I took the first drink, I walked into the doors of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, why did I walk into the doors of Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous? Well, mainly the reason I walked in the doors of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous is because all those things that those people had been telling me all those years had begun to come true in my life. I had lost the love and the respect that mother and father had for me when I was a young boy growing up. I had lost the love of that wife I had that I married when I was 21 years old. I had lost that great job that I had and was so in love with. And I was beginning to lose the thing that a man holds nearest and dearest to his heart, my own self-respect. As you see, I was in the process, 24 years later, of being divorced by a second wife. I was in the process of losing 3 beautiful stepchildren that I loved them and they loved me. I was in the process of losing a beautiful, beautiful, blonde-headed, blue-eyed little daughter of our own that we had had after we got married. I was in the process of losing a farm that I owned in northwest Arkansas. I was in the process of losing everything I held near and dear to my heart, including my own self-respect. Now, this lady that I'd married for the second marriage, a beautiful red-headed lady, and a lot of you know her, and she's a fine woman, and I love her deeply. But about 24 years after I took that first drink, I wasn't so sure that I loved her that much anymore. Because, you see, she had begun to do all those things that people do who live with us. Trying to control my drinking, trying to stop my drinking. She had done all the things that everybody that's married to an alcoholic tries to do. And one of the things that she had done in the last year of my drinking is she had filed for divorce 3 times. And every time she would file for divorce, I would go in the house and I would clean up and shave and put on sweet smell-em, and I would swear to her that I'm not going to drink anymore, really fully intending to not drink anymore. You know, people that don't understand this don't understand. When we say we're not going to drink anymore, we absolutely mean that. We don't know that we can't live up to that promise. And I would promise Barbara, if you'll just drop these divorce proceedings, then I'll stop drinking and everything would be all right. And she would do so. And I'd stay sober for a period of time, but then as the big book says, I would be restless, irritable, and discontented, and I wouldn't feel good, and I'd want to feel better. And I would begin to remember the sense of ease and comfort that comes from those first 2 drinks. Not the jailhouse, not the divorce courts, not the hospitals, just a sense of ease and comfort that comes at once by taking a couple of drinks. And based on that idea, I'd take a couple of drinks and I'd trigger the allergy and I wouldn't be able to stop drinking. And eventually Barbara would file for divorce again. She didn't want a divorce any more than I did, but she found out that divorces stopped me from drinking, at least for a period of time. On this 3rd divorce, Barbara's sister, who lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, had sent her some information about 2 fellowships. One was the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the other was the Fellowship of Al-Anon. And Barbara had read that information, and she had made contact with some people from Al-Anon. And Barbara had gone to an Al-Anon meeting. Now, on this 3rd divorce, the sheriff had come out and forcibly removed me from my home, certainly against my wishes, I'll guarantee you. And when Barbara went to Al-Anon, they told her about alcoholism. And they told her I drank the way I drank, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. And they told me that all those things, they told her that all those things that I did while drinking was not because I didn't love her, but because I was a person suffering from alcoholism and I was a sick human being. And the night Barbara went to Al-Anon, she called me when she got back home. And she said, Charlie, I believe I know what the problem is. She said, if you would like to come back home, we'll try to work this thing out. Do you want to come back home? And certainly I wanted to come back home. There was the house I'd built with my own 2 hands. There was the 3 children I loved so deeply. There was my livelihood and everything involved. And I immediately went back home, and I continued to drink, and Barbara continued to go to Al-Anon. Now, there's been a lot of kidding about Al-Anon this weekend. And I know that all of it has just been in good faith kidding. I tell you what I think about Al-Anon. I think it's the greatest thing that ever happened to Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, you people can't make us drink and you can't make us stay sober, but you can sure as hell make us thirsty, you know. And I find that those people who are attending Al-Anon, their spouses or the other members of the family, it makes it a hell of a lot easier for people like us to stay sober. And Barbara got off my back immediately and left me alone. And she continued to go to Al-Anon and I continued to drink. But there was something wrong with my drinking now. You know, always before, when I needed to drink real bad, I could always pick a fight with Barbara. And after we had a good fight, then I would have an excuse to leave home and get drunk. After all, who could stay sober living with a woman like that anyhow? But now then, she wouldn't fight with me anymore. And I had to start looking at me and had to start seeing why I drink the way I drink. And finally, I began to realize that I had a problem with alcohol just as much as anybody else does. And Barbara said to me one day, she said, Charlie, I have a sponsor in Al-Anon named Wanda, and her husband is a fellow named Floyd, And she said, would you be willing to talk to Floyd about AA if he would come to our house? And I said, well, yeah, I guess so. Now, I didn't think I was alcoholic, and I certainly didn't belong in AA, but I knew this guy named Floyd, and he was a fairly decent guy, and I knew that he drank like hell when he drank, and I said, yeah, I'll be willing to talk to Floyd to keep peace in the family. And Floyd and Wanda came to our house, and Barbara and Wanda got up and left, and Floyd and I sat down in my kitchen. Now, Floyd did something for me that no human being's ever been able to do before, and certainly never since. He sat down in my kitchen and he talked to me about his alcoholism. He talked to me about his drinking. Now, everybody else had talked to me about my drinking. Barbara had, the police had, the banker had, my brother had, everybody had, but Floyd didn't seem to give a damn about my drinking at all. He talked to me about, in fact, he kind of pissed me off before he was through. You know, I thought, hell, are we going to talk about me or not? You know? But in talking about his drinking, he let me see what was wrong with me. In talking about his allergy to alcohol, in talking about his powerlessness over alcohol, in talking about the things that alcohol had done to him and caused him to do, he let me identify with another alcoholic, and he let me see that I had the same problem that he had. Nobody's ever been able to do that before. Floyd sat down with me and he talked to me about a possible means of recovery from this thing. And he talked to me about spirituality. He didn't talk to me about religion. He didn't talk to me about anything that smacked of religion. He simply talked to me about a spiritual program of action. You know, God works in mysterious ways. That's been now about 23 years ago when Floyd talked to me. My friend Floyd's never been able to get sober. He's never had any long-term sobriety in AA. He goes to meetings and he gets drunk, and he goes to meetings and he gets drunk. And one time I'd been sober 4, 5, or 6 years, and I decided, by God, I'd sober Floyd up. I'll take care of him. And I took Floyd to an AA meeting every night for 365 nights. And Floyd stayed sober for a year, and we had his little birthday party, and I gave him his lighter, and he cried and I cried, and the next day he went out and got drunk. My friend Floyd is a hopeless cripple today. He's an absolute wet brain. I've never understood, you know, why him doing that and not me. How come I'm one of the lucky ones, you know? How come I'm one of the lucky ones? But Floyd gave me what I needed. And he took me to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I walked into a little meeting down in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. Maybe 10, 12, 14 people there. I really don't know what I expected to see when I walked in there. I think I expected the men all to be old. I certainly expected them to be crippled and beat up. If I expected to see women, I didn't expect to see nice-looking women. I expected to see what I thought alcoholism was, and when I walked in that door, I was absolutely amazed. The men were all cleaned up. None of them were all crippled up. They all seemed to be clean-shaven, had on nice clothes. The women were absolutely beautiful, and I'd get around one of them and smell of them, and they didn't smell like drunks. They smelled like a real lady ought to smell, and I was amazed by these people. I think what impressed me the most when I walked into that meeting that night is everybody in that room shook my hand, and they said, "Hello, Charlie, how are you?" They said, "Man, we're glad to see you." Said, "You've been having a little trouble with alcohol?" And I said, "Yes, I have. And I guess the reason I'm here is to find out what to do about it." And they proceeded to tell me. One guy said, "We believe for new people." And he said, "It's not a bad idea for old members either, but for new people, you need to come to 4, 5, 6 AA meetings a week." He said, "You need to stay with people like us as much as you possibly can. We understand you." Another one handed me this book, and he said, "Charlie, this is the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous." And he said, "If you'll take it and read it and study it and do what it says to do, you'll never have to take another drink as long as you live if you don't want to drink." And another guy, and I see him here today. You see them at every AA meeting. They're old. They're bald-headed. They've been around AA forever. And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, "Son," now in those days I was younger than I am now. I was only 38, and he said, "Son, if you really want to stay sober, sooner or later, you'll have to turn your will and your life over to the care of God as you understand Him." And I said, "You people do not understand me at all." I said, "I like you. I love your coffee. You've made me feel good. But you don't understand the fact that I own a farm up here, And on that farm, I've got 45,000 chickens, and I've got 100 head cattle operation, and I've got 30 sows, and I've got a 500 hog feeder operation, and I've got a red-headed wife and 4 kids and 2 bird dogs. And if you got that kind of stuff, you can't go to 4, 5, 6 AA meetings a week. You've got to stay home and get your rest in order to be able to do those things. I looked at your book, and I went to How It Works, where they told me to go, and I read the steps, and I damn near vomited. Because step 1 said we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, our lives had become unmanageable, and I had never admitted I was powerless over anything in my life, period, and I wasn't about to now. Step 2 said we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, and I said, don't tell me I'm crazy. I said, look at what I've got. Look at this farm, look at those cattle, look at those hogs. Don't tell me I'm crazy. Yeah, I do stupid things when I'm drinking, but when I'm sober, I'm like everybody else. And I looked that old man in the eye and I said, don't tell me about God. I already know about God. I learned about God in the Southern Baptist Church. I learned about going to hell for lying and cheating and stealing and drinking whiskey and committing adultery. And by the time I got to AA, I'd been doing that for 26 years. And I knew that God had already told St. Peter, when that little 4-eyed sucker gets up here, send him downstairs. We'll not need his kind. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do, though. I said, I'll come to your meetings every Friday night. And I'll work this program any way I want to. And I'll stay sober. And if you don't believe me, you watch me. I'm getting ready to do just exactly that. Now, any other fellowship in the world would have taken an arrogant little SOB by me, like me, picked me up by my britches, and thrown me right out the damn door. You know what they did? They all leaned back and smiled and said, keep coming back, everything will be all right. And I kept going to their meetings every Friday night, and I didn't miss a meeting. And as the time went by, I got sicker, and I got sicker, and I got sicker, and I got sicker. You see, I didn't know that the only thing that had ever made me feel good in my life, I had now quit using it. And I didn't know that alcohol had become a power greater than I was, and I didn't know that if I didn't replace alcohol with something as great or greater, that I'd never be able to feel good again in my life as long as I lived. And I kept going to those meetings, and I kept enjoying your fellowship, and I kept drinking your coffee, and as time went by, I got worse, and I got worse, and I got worse. And at the end of 90 days, I'd been hearing them talk about having slips, and I decided it's time for me to have one. And I took a drink, and I triggered my allergy, and I couldn't stop drinking. Now, in those days when I started drinking, I would have to drink until I just got so sick I couldn't drink anymore. And when I drink myself all the way down, and that may take a month or it may take 3 months, I would end up going to the liquor store, and with my vodka I would get some beer, and then I would gradually begin to taper off of that vodka, and it would take me about a week to get from vodka to beer, then about another week to get off the beer, and then I came right back to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I walked in the door in Siloam Springs, Arkansas, and they all were standing there, and they were all smiling, and they all stuck their hands out, and they said, hello, Charlie, how are you? We're glad to see you back. Have you been having a little trouble with alcohol? And I said, yes, I have. And the reason I'm here is to find out what to do about it, and they proceeded to tell me. One of them said you need to go to 4, 5, 6 AA meetings a week. And one of them said, if you'll read and study this book, you'll be okay. And the old bald-headed man said, son, sooner or later, you'll have to turn your will and your life over to the care of God as you understand Him if you want to stay sober. And again, these people didn't understand me. I said, I cannot do these things, but I'll come to your meeting every Friday night, and I'll not miss a meeting, and I'll work it the way I want to, and I'll stay sober, and if you don't believe me, you watch them. I'm getting ready to do it. And they said, keep coming back, and I did. And 6 months later, I was sicker than I'd ever been in my life. I couldn't get along with Barbara. I couldn't get along with my kids. I couldn't get along with my bird dogs. I couldn't get along with my neighbors. I didn't like the people in AA, and I didn't like me, and I wanted to feel better, and the only thing that I knew to make me feel better would be to take a drink of whiskey, and I took it. And I got drunk, and I got sick, and I got in all kinds of trouble. And 3 or 4 months later, I finally tapered off, sobered up, went back to AA, walked in the meeting on Friday night, and there they all stood. Had their hands sticking out, and they said, hello, Charlie, how are you, man? We're glad to see you back. You been having trouble with alcohol? I said, yes, I have. The reason I'm here is to find out what to do about it, and they proceeded to tell me. One of them said, by God, you need to go to 4 or 5 or 6 AA meetings a week. And the other one said, here's the damn book. Take it and read it and do what it says. And that old man said, "Boy, I'm getting tired telling you this. But sooner or later, you're going to have to turn your will and your life over to the care of God as you understand Him." And again, I said to these people, I cannot do those things. And as I look back on that in retrospect today, I realize I could not do those things. Now, why could I not do those things? Well, I hadn't been defeated. I could stop drinking on my own. Now, if you could stop drinking on your own, there's no way you could possibly be an alcoholic, because alcoholics can't do that. Now, even though it took me 2 or 3 or 4 weeks to taper off and get stopped, I could stop on my own, so I wasn't powerless over alcohol. And I said, I can't do these things you're asking me to do, but I'll come to your meetings every Friday night, and I'll work this program the way I want to, and I'll stay sober, and if you don't believe me, you watch me. I'm getting ready to do it. And they smiled, and they said, keep coming back, and I did. And 9 months later, I reached a point in my life I hope I never reach again. 9 months later, I was faced with one of 2 decisions. I had to decide whether to get drunk or whether to blow my brains out. I didn't feel good. Nothing was going right for me in my life. Everything I seemed to do went to hell. And nobody seemed to care for me, and I didn't seem to care for anybody else. And life was absolutely not worth living without drinking. Now, I knew if I drank, I'd get drunk, and I knew what would happen. But I also knew that I couldn't face life sober the way I was living anymore. And I believe any time the pain of sobriety gets worse than the pain of drinking, we're probably going to go back to drinking. And it seemed to me that getting drunk would be less painful than going to this AA thing, fellowship only, and not enjoying life. Now, I didn't want to die then, I don't want to die today. So what I decided to do, rather than blow my brains out, was simply to take a drink. And I took a drink, and I triggered the allergy, and I couldn't stop drinking. And I drank for 3 or 4 months, and things began to take place in my life this time that had never happened before. As the time went by, the drinking got worse and worse. And I got to the point where it was necessary for me to start trying to sober up again, and I couldn't sober up. And I'd go to the liquor store, and I'd buy a 5th of vodka, and I'd buy a case of beer, and I'd try to drink that beer, and that beer would just drink like drinking water. It wasn't doing anything for me at all. And the days began to stretch into weeks, and the weeks began to stretch into months. And Barbara and the kids moved me into the utility room, and I reached a point where I couldn't eat any longer, and I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't drink coffee, and I couldn't smoke cigarettes. About all I could do is drink vodka and wake up an hour or 2 or 3 later shaking and trembling and sick all over, and knowing I couldn't drink anymore, but knowing I couldn't live without taking a drink, and take a drink of vodka and pass out again, and it went on day after day after day after day. And one day Barbara stuck her head in that utility room door, and she said, "Hon, you're sick, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." She said, "Do you have anything left to drink?" And I said, "No, I've drank it all." And she said, "Well, I'll be right back." In about an hour, she came back, and she handed me 12 pint bottles of vodka, all different flavors. And she said, "You love this more than you love anything else. Here, this is what you need." Now, for years, I thought Barbara did that through the goodness of her heart. Today, I realize that they had already taught her, let him drink all he wants to. And the more he drinks and the faster he drinks, the better off everybody's going to be. They had taught her that I would either reach bottom or I would die, one of the two, and in her case, the problem would be solved, and she wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. And she helped me get where I needed to go. I thought that 12 pints of vodka would last me for 3 or 4 weeks, and some 2 or 3 days later, I woke up, and those 12 pints of vodka were all gone. And I didn't have any more to drink, and I knew that I was dying from this thing called alcoholism. And I didn't want to die. And I sure as hell didn't want to die drunk. And I did something that morning that I'd never been able to do before. I turned to Barbara and I said, "Barbara, I need help. I can't stop drinking." I was 40 years old. I could never remember asking another human being for help in my entire lifetime. And that's exactly what Barbara had been waiting for. And she turned immediately to the phone, and she called my friend Floyd, and Floyd came over with a big fellow named Bus Hester. Bus was a big, tall, tough telephone line repairman. Loved old Bus dearly. And they walked in that utility room, and they looked at me, and Bus turned to Floyd, and he said, "Man, we got to take him to the hospital." They said if we try to sober him up, he'll die on us just sure as anything. And Floyd said, come on, boy, let's get you cleaned up and let's go to the hospital, let's get some help. And I looked at Floyd and Buster and I said, no, fellas, thank you. I don't believe I'm that bad. I think I can do this my way. And old Bus looked at Floyd and he said, well, if that's what he really believes, there's nothing we can do to help him. And he said, let's go home. And as they left my home, Floyd looked back through that utility room door and he said, Charlie, if you need me, call me and I'll be back. And they left, and I sat there on that old cot in that utility room trying to drink some beer and trying to feel better, and I knew I couldn't do it. I knew there's no way that I could make this my way. And maybe an hour later, somehow, some way, I got to the phone and I called Floyd. And Floyd said, I'll be right back. Be right there. And Floyd lived probably 10 miles away from me on gravel roads, and it seemed like it wasn't over 5 minutes, and there he drove up in my front yard. And I'm sitting on the porch now. I've got a half a can of beer in my hand. And he said, come on, boy, bring your beer and let's go to the hospital. And I said, no, I'm not taking this beer. I've had all of this stuff I can stand. And I set that half a can of beer down and walked away and left it. And I can never remember leaving anything that had alcohol in it, walking away and leaving it before in my entire life. And I left that half a can of beer sitting on my front porch. I don't know what happened to it today. And Floyd took me to the hospital, and there they gave me the proper medication, the shots, those things necessary to ward off the DTs and the convulsions. And I don't really know what took place in the next 3 or 4 days, but I woke up in there 3 or 4 days later, and I woke up in a place I'd never been before. Not in my body, but in my mind. I woke up in a place of absolute, complete defeat. I have no quarrel with Bill Wilson. I have no trouble understanding Bill in Bill's story in the big book when he said, no words can tell of the loneliness and despair that I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I'd met my match. I'd been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. And that day I knew that alcohol had completely defeated me. And I didn't know what I'm going to do about that. And I know if I leave this hospital, I'm going to drink. And I know that if I drink again, I'm going to die just as sure as anything. And I was laying in that bed, and another thought came to mind. And another old fellow in AA had said to me one time, son, if you in complete desperation are in bad trouble and you don't know where to turn, try a little prayer and see what happens. And I remember lying in that bed looking straight up at the ceiling and saying to myself, do you dare pray? And I said, no, you don't pray. Only weak people pray. Strong people like you are that stand on their own 2 feet, they don't pray to anything or anybody. And my mind said, what are you going to do if you don't? And I said, I don't know, but I can't pray. And my mind said, well what would it hurt to try? There's not a soul in this room, and nobody else is going to see it, and if it doesn't work, you'll be the only one to know so. And I uttered a prayer, which was an absolute false prayer. I said, God, if there is a kind and loving God, can you remove from me the obsession to drink alcohol? I have no idea what happened. I wasn't like Bill. I didn't feel as if the clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. I didn't feel as if the room had been filled with a blinding flash of light. But I tell you what happened to me. The instant I uttered that prayer, I knew that I never had to take another drink of alcohol as long as I lived if I didn't want to. And I didn't know what I was going to do to not drink, but I knew I didn't have to drink anymore. And I got up and I left that hospital and I went right back to AA. And I walked in the meeting down Siloam Springs, Arkansas, and there they all stood and they had their hands out and they said, hello, Charlie, how are you? They said, man, we're glad to see you back. Have you been having a little trouble with alcohol? I said, yes, I have. And I didn't ask them what to do about it. And they didn't tell me what to do about it. I started going to 4, 5, 6 AA meetings a week. I began to read and study the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. I began to ask this God who I did not understand on a daily basis each morning, please God, one more day of sobriety. I began to thank him every night when I went to bed. Thank you, God, for one more day of sobriety. Take care of me tonight, and I'll see you in the morning. And slowly, slowly, this time things began to change for the better. You see, what had happened to me before, in 18 months in being in AA, I had participated in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. I did nothing about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Nobody was telling me about the program. Nobody was showing me the steps. Nobody was helping me understand them. Nobody was helping me read the book. They were just saying, come to meetings, and everything will be all right. They were saying, come to meetings long enough and you'll soak it up by osmosis and everything will be fine. They were saying, take what you want, leave what you want, and they damn near killed me. I think the greatest mistake we're making in AA today is nobody's telling the newcomer about the program. Everybody's saying we come to the program. We don't come to the program, we come to the fellowship. And if we're lucky, within the fellowship we'll find the program. And everybody's expecting the newcomer, who is the sickest of the sickest, to be able to read the big book and understand the program and work it on their own. Bullshit. You know, they say you can't teach. Teaching is nothing more than the transference of information from the mind of one human being to another. Those who have walked the walk owe the responsibility to the one coming in the door to help them walk that same walk. You can't expect the sickest of the sickest to read and understand anything. The older members of AA owe it to the new members to not only tell them about the steps, but take them by the hand and walk with them through the steps according to the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, we're spending millions and millions of dollars. We're spending hundreds of thousands of man-hours trying to get people coming into AA, and we got hundreds of thousands of them sitting around us dying from alcoholism every damn day, simply because we're not telling them what they need to know. And I believe if we would do so, we could avert death in countless thousands of people. Let me tell you briefly what happened to me after I started to work the program. For a long time, I tried to read the big books, starting with chapter 5, which is where they told me to go in the beginning. Today I realize that's an absolute mistake. It is a textbook. You need to start in the front. It gives you certain information. And like all textbooks, it takes that information and builds upon that information as you progress through the book. And as I began to read and study this book, starting way, way back with a doctor's opinion, for the first time I understood alcoholism. I thought it was weak will. I thought it was moral character. I thought it was sin. Why would I not think so? Everybody had told me that all my life. I read in this book, in the doctor's opinion, that I have a thing called alcoholism, that I have a physical allergy to alcohol, that my body reacts differently when I take a drink. I found out that I have an obsession of the mind, and I don't think about alcohol like normal people think about it. That just before I drink, I believe I can drink. That just before I drink, I think this time it's going to be different. My mind refuses to remember the suffering and the pain and the humiliation of the last drunk. If we alcoholics could see a drunk all the way through, we never would take a drink. But we can't see it all the way through. We can't see beyond the first couple of drinks, that great sense of ease and comfort we're going to get from taking 2 drinks. And based on a lie, we drink. I found out I'm abnormal physically and I'm abnormal mentally when it comes to alcohol. I found out that I had a form of insanity. I'm not crazy. I have a form of insanity. Sanity simply means the ability to see the truth. And just before we alcoholics drink, we can't see the truth. We believe a lie. We have a form of insanity, and it takes a power greater than human power to restore us to sanity. I began to read that and see that in Bill's story and in chapter 2 in the big book. I began to read in more about alcoholism. The real problem of the alcoholic centers in the mind rather than the body. That if I don't take the first drink, the allergy can't hurt me. Just like if I'm allergic to strawberries, they can't hurt me unless I eat strawberries. If I'm allergic to alcohol, it can't hurt me unless I drink. And all action is born in thought. And just before I drink, I think it's okay to drink. The real problem's in the mind, not the body. I found in chapter 4 one of the greatest pieces of information I've ever read in my life. You know, God to me was a punishing God, hellfire and brimstone. Now, when I get to chapter 5, I've got to make a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand Him. How in the hell can I make a decision to turn my will and my life over to something that's going to zap me and send me to hell anyhow? Chapter 4 gave me a new understanding of God. Chapter 4 told me about a kind and a loving God. Chapter 4 told me about a God that I can accept in my life. Chapter 4 gave me a way to start finding God. Always the minister in church said, son, all you got to do is have faith. I couldn't have faith in anything. The big book says you don't need faith, you just got to believe. Do you believe there's a power greater than human power? I've always believed in God. Wrong belief, but I've always believed in God. And the big book says that's all you need to start. And it let me make the transition from that form of insanity to making a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand Him. In chapter 5, I read how it works again. Today I think I understand how it works. For years I've wondered why it works. Today I think I understand why it works. I'm not sure, but I think I understand why it works. I believe that every human being is born to live in 3 dimensions of life. I've heard about them all my life. I've read about them, never understood them until recently. All human beings are born to live in a spiritual dimension, a mental dimension, and a physical dimension. My book tells me that God dwells within me. And it tells me that God dwells within all human beings. And if that's true, and I believe it is, and that means I've got to live with God. Whether I like it or not is beside the point. The question is, do I live with God in harmony or disharmony? All my life I've been in disharmony with God. All human beings are born with a mind. Now sometimes we act like we don't have one, but we do. And we got to live with our mind, whether we like it or not. The question is, do we live with it in harmony or disharmony? I've always been in disharmony with my mind, never satisfied with where I was, what I was doing, what was going on, or anything else. All human beings are born to live in this physical world. For a long time, I thought the physical dimension was my body only. Today, I realize it's everything in the world, period. We have no other place to live except here in this world as we know it today. Now the question is, do we live there in harmony or disharmony? I've always been in disharmony. Never could get along with anybody or anything in this world. The big book tells me it is a design for living that really works under all conditions. And I think the reason it works under all conditions is because it matches the design that God intended for human beings to live in the first place. I think that I got right with God through steps 1, 2, and 3. I think for the first time in my life I formed the proper relationship with God to let God be the director of my life. I had been selfish, self-centered. I who had directed my life and the lives of everybody around me made a decision to let God direct my life. Now why did I make the decision? Because I was powerless and I needed the power. That's why. Step 1, 2, and 3 got me right in the spiritual dimension. 4, 5, 6, and 7 got me right in my mind. For the first time, I looked at me. I looked to see what's within me that blocks me off from God. I looked to see what's within me that creates my problems. And I could see that resentments, fear, guilt, shame, and remorse from people I'd hurt, that kind of thinking was occupying my mind entirely. And there's no way that God could direct my thinking as long as those things were there. And my book gave me a way through step 4 to look at those things truthfully for the first time in my life. And I began to realize that my resentments were not true. That all the things and all the places that I resented so badly, that I had done something to them. And they in turn had retaliated against me. And then I had used resentments to transfer blame from me to them. And my resentments were no longer true. I began to see where the majority of my fears were based on untruths also. And I began to see that if I didn't change my character, I would keep hurting people and I would always be eaten up with shame, fear, guilt, and remorse. And I began to see that I had become a very selfish, very dishonest, very self-seeking, frightened, and inconsiderate individual. And because of that kind of personality, I was robbing myself of any possibility of peace of mind. And if I didn't change, that sooner or later, looking for the sense of ease and comfort, I'd go back to drinking. And I began to see what's within me that needs to be changed. And I talked about it to another human being, and I became ready to have God remove it. And God and I started working on those things in step 7. And I got right in my head. After I got right in my mind, then I could get right with my fellow man. There's where I began to make amends. I'll tell you, the greatest amend that I can make to me is to make my amends to others. And as I make my amends to others, the shame and the fear and the guilt and the remorse disappears, and I finally am sober and have some peace of mind. You see, the promises come after step 9. They come after I get right with God, myself, and my fellow man. They don't come before that. And then after I receive the promises, I think we have 3 steps left in our program. And I don't think they're maintenance steps. Sure, they'll maintain sobriety. But I really think they're growth steps. You know, there's a spiritual law that says nothing ever stays the same. Everything in this universe is in a constant state of change. By the time I've completed step 9, I've had a tremendous amount of spiritual growth. But if I don't continue to grow spiritually, I will begin to slip back. And if I do my step 10, as my book tells me to do, it says continue to watch for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. That's step 4. It says when these crop up, we talk to somebody else about them. That's step 5. We ask God to remove those things. That's 6 and 7, and then we make amends quickly, and that's 8 and 9. I believe 10, the way the book says to do it, is a continual working of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 the rest of my life. And as I work those steps, I can't stay the same. I must get better. My relationship with God, myself, and my fellow man become better and better. And then in step 11, I seek to improve, not to maintain, to improve my conscious contact with God as I understand Him. Bill wrote for me in this book, on about 2.5 pages, some of the greatest information I've ever read. Bill was not a spiritual giant. Bill was a real alcoholic. Bill was a con artist and a manipulator. He knew nothing about spirituality, and he couldn't write very much about it. But he gave us a series of exercises that if we will follow them, we can develop our own life of prayer and meditation. And he told me what I needed to do in the morning, what I needed to do during the day. He told me what to do in the evening. He told me what to do when I faced indecision. He told me how to pray. And through practicing those suggestions, I have developed a form of prayer and meditation in my own life. And I really believe today that I've made some kind of conscious contact with God as I understand Him. Now, everybody's always wanting to know what God's will is. Well, God's will is very simple, as far as I'm concerned. Step 12 gives me the greatest promise to be found anywhere in the big book. It says, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. Not a result, not some result, the result of these steps. I think it's a promise that if I will apply the first 11 steps to the best of my ability, I'm guaranteed a spiritual awakening. Now, what is a spiritual awakening? Well, Bill says in the 12 and 12, there's many kinds of spiritual awakenings. There are people in AA today, but they all got certain things in common. That is, we're able to feel, believe, and do things we could never do before on our own strength unaided. I feel things today I've never felt before. I feel love. I never knew what love was. I always thought love was mixed up with sex. It has nothing to do with sex. Love is patience, tolerance, goodwill towards your fellow man, compassion, understanding. I never felt any of that before AA. Before AA, I could care less about you. Oh yeah, you could have some after I got everything I wanted, but I always came first. I'm not that way anymore. I believe things that I never believed before. I believe God's a kind and a loving God. I believe He stands ready to help any human being anywhere in the world when they're ready to give up on self and turn to Him. Always before I believed He was hellfire and brimstone. Thank God He isn't. Thank God my God today is not a God of justice. If He was, I wouldn't be standing behind this podium. He's a God of mercy, He must be. I can do things I never could do before. I can stay sober. I never could do that before. And because of the fact I'm sober, I'm allowed to do many, 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 many things I never could do before drinking. Now, what's God's will? Well, it's in the next part of that step. Having had a spiritual awakening is the result of these steps. We tried to carry this message, T-H-I-S, not the message, not a message, not some message, this message. What is this message? Having had a spiritual awakening is the result of these steps. That's the only message we know. You know, some of us get to thinking we're healers. Some of us get to thinking we're marital advisors, economic advice. I don't know if anybody screwed it up worse than we did. We know one thing. We know the result of using the first 11 steps in our life. We know that that results in a spiritual awakening. I no longer believe in God. I today have faith in God. Now, those of us that have had the spiritual awakening that know that God works in our lives, then we are charged with the responsibility of carrying this information to the one who does not know. And it goes like this. If you are all screwed up in your life and you're not feeling good, I know where you're coming from. I used to be like that too. And through this fellowship, I found a program, and I applied that program in my life, and I've had a spiritual awakening, and I don't feel that way anymore. And if you would like to feel like I feel, then you apply the same steps in your life, and you won't feel that way anymore either. And that's the only message we got. I'm charged with the responsibility of taking the newcomer who does not believe, or who believes and acts as if he doesn't believe, help him come to believe, help him work the steps, and walk with him as he works them, so he can have his spiritual awakening, and then he can go help the next newcomer. And that's all we're good for. That's all we're good for. I really believe that God, in his wisdom, got tired of seeing people like us die way back in the 1930s. I believe God took Bill and Bob and all the rest of them and put them together so we would have this thing today. God's always worked with people through people. He's always used people for purposes, and I believe he chose those people. Now, all the first 100 are dead. Who's going to do the job today? If God chose people then, and surely he keeps using them today. There's not an alcoholic in this room today that should not already be dead. Some of us 2 or 3 times. And we woke up and said, wasn't we lucky last night? No, luck had nothing to do with it. I think God picked us out. I think he let us suffer our alcoholism so we would learn what he wants us to know. And when he got ready to use us, he removed the obsession to drink. We had nothing to do with that. He removed the obsession to drink. As my friend Joe said last night, well over 90% of us are going to die never even knowing we're alcoholic. Less than 5% of us stumble in the doors of AA. Less than half of us are recovering. We're talking about 2, maybe 3 out of 100. And I used to say, God, why am I an alcoholic? Today I say, God, why am I not one of those that's dying? Surely, surely God has picked us out to do a job. I think we're the luckiest people in the world. I think we have a very unique knowledge that nobody else possesses. We know more about alcoholism than anybody alive. We're the only people in the world ever experienced it. We're the professionals in recovery. We know more about it than anybody alive. We're the only people ever experienced it. How dare they tell me I don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to alcoholism? How dare they tell you that? God has given us some very unique knowledge to help a very unique group of people. And he's given us the opportunity to avert death in countless thousands and thousands of people, and very few people get that opportunity. I think we're the luckiest people alive. I've got to do one more thing, and then I'll be through, and that's practice these principles in all my affairs. Well, what are these principles? Bill uses the word these twice in step 12, and both times he uses it in reference to these steps. And how it works, he said, do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to practice anything like perfect adherence to these principles. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. Now, what did he set down just before he made that statement? That was the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. In the 12 and 12, in the front of it, he said the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous are a set of principles spiritual in nature, which, if practiced, will expel the obsession to drink. I've never seen him use the word principles in writing unless it was in connection with the 12 steps. They are a set of principles. Now, it's easy for me to practice my 12-step program in AA. I love you, and hopefully you love me, and we're going to do our best not to hurt each other. But I'm only in AA 1 or 2 hours a day. What do I do the other 22 hours? Can I practice these principles after I leave AA? How about in my home? Can I practice these principles with my spouse in my home? Can I realize how powerless I am over Barbara? Do I realize the complete insanity of me trying to control her life, knowing full well I can't? Can I make a decision to turn her will and her life over to the care of God as I understand Him? Can I inventory me and see why I still need to try to control her, knowing I can't do so? Can I talk about that to another human being? Can I find those character defects and become willing to work on those also? Can I make amends to her quickly when I've harmed her? You know, there's times I'm absolutely ashamed of me. There's times I treat strangers on the street with more courtesy than I treat my own spouse in my own home. You know, if I could practice these principles in my home with my spouse, chances are I could have some peace of mind, serenity, and happiness there 10, 12, 14 hours a day. If I don't practice them with her, hell, we don't stand a chance. We're at each other's throat continually. Thank God she's in Al-Anon, and they have a program, and she works her program too. And we have a great life because we're both practicing these principles in our home. How about with my children? Can I realize how powerless I am over them? Can I realize the insanity of me trying to control their lives? Can I make that decision with them? Can I make amends with them quickly when I've smarted off at them? If I could do that with my children, then what time we have together is good time. If I don't, we're in constant conflict with each other, and I rob myself of peace of mind. How about on the job? Can I realize how powerless I am over my coworkers? Can I realize the insanity of me trying to control everything around me? Can I make a decision can I do that there? You know, I think what we're saying is this. We have a design for living that works under all circumstances, providing we're willing to practice it anywhere we go. Now, why does it work? Well, it works because it's a set of spiritual principles. And every true spiritual movement in the world today, and people say, how do you know if it's true or not? Well, does it work? If it works, it's got to be true. Every true spiritual movement in the world today has the same set of principles. God made human beings. God wrote the directions. God made the principles. They're in the Bible. They're in the Quran. They're in the Torah. They're in every piece of true spiritual information I've ever read. They are designed for living that really works, that allows people like us to be happy, peaceful, and free 24 hours a day, 365 days a year if we choose to. And when I'm sober and peaceful and happy and free, then I don't need to drink to feel better. That's what comes from the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Thank you all for letting me be here. I love you very deeply.